Hi, everyone. Welcome to All the Forbidden Things. This is the show where we talk about all the things we're not talking about. Today, we're going to be talking about the death of the American dream, and if that is actually happening, how people are dealing with things like buying a home, starting a family, and whether the world is all that different now than it was 50 years ago, and if there's anything that we can do about that. So today I am joined by David Rand. He is the president and CEO of the Land Liberty Movement, an organization that publishes Build the Dream. David, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into it?
Sure. Yeah. So, thank you so much for having me. I live in Montana. I'm from here, born here, and I started my career about 15 years ago doing elections and then public policy. And public policy, I got involved in all kinds of different issues, everything from campus free speech to reducing the legal barriers to becoming a cosmetologist to legalizing Uber in my state, to lots of a very wide range of public policy issues. But then in 2023, we had this big problem, which is housing. Our housing became very expensive. And so with a wide coalition of other people, Democrats, Republicans, builders, think tanks, the governor, many other groups, got together to pass a suite of legislation that became known popularly as the Montana Miracle, where we went from one of the most constrained states to one of the freest states to build housing in the country. When we did that, that was very strange, right? Because we're a pretty right wing Republican state, and no one really saw it coming. We did it again in 2025, doubled down even further, and then soon afterwards, I decided I wanted to try to take what we were doing here in Montana and bring it nationally to save the American dream, to make sure it isn't dead, that it can be brought back to life.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So let's both answer this then. Do we think the American dream is dead or dying? So
Mm,
you don't, I know, but you can tell me why or why it might be on the decline.
right.
Um, I think that people are clinging to it, but it just looks very different today. I think it's just evolving. I think in some way, if we don't evolve with it, um, we we might struggle to. Then you have almost a generational issue, but most every human being, every human animal is looking for shelter and family and community and
Mhm.
all of that. So, but to me, what makes something specifically the American dream is the idea of the rags to riches aspect, and also just that you can freely build um, a life for your family and a hearth, and live by your own values. And if you work hard, then you can get somewhere and be
Mhm.
successful. I think that's
Mhm.
kind of how I understand it. It's definitely eroding because of various practical and institutional factors we can get into. But I also think that there are some values that are shifting based on people pursuing different lifestyles or having um, just a more global society with social media. Then AI is, of course, going to make a huge difference. So that's my
Mm.
thought on it. Where do you stand?
Yeah, I think the big question, and this is a perennial human question, ultimately is what shapes what? Chicken and the egg here, between institutions and the way they express themselves and people's individual choices. Are people choosing a different life because, well, it's impossible to not impossible, very difficult to afford a home? Are they choosing to rent longer because that's just simply their values, or because we've made it systemically impossible to save up enough money to get that down payment? A great example of that, and getting into the reasons why we can hold on to that, but I believe there was the death of the starter home. We just stopped building starter homes, and if you look at the data, I think there's a solid case there. And with that, it did that change people's values, or did people's values change and then we did the other way around? I think the data points the other direction. Now, what that means in terms of I wouldn't I like the way that you're talking about the American dream as an expression of an older idea, even than the American dream, which is the pursuit of happiness. And important to understand that, while my organization's around housing policy and a movement to reform it, it's a much bigger concept too in many ways. It's just that shelter is one of those very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that everyone needs in order to have anything else be possible. That kind of actualization of your potential is only really possible when you got food and shelter and security and things like that, right? So, um, about 30% of the richest generation in American history, the boomer generation, just never bought a home. 60% of those people who didn't do that, who didn't buy a home ever as a boomer, did so because they didn't want to. They could have, but they just didn't want to. And that's the American dream too. There's no shame in renting. Even as a more conservative, libertarian type person, I like the idea of people owning as much as they want to own, but the key word there is want, and not forcing anyone into a particular life vision like that.
Mhm.
And lastly, I think you're right. Meritocracy is the core of this idea that if I work hard, if I do the things that lead to a high probability of success, then me and my cohort will. And what I mean by a high probability of success is, hey, don't have kids before you're ready to. Hey, don't go to prison. Like get a GED at least, if not, some amount of education and specialization to give you a comparative advantage in the marketplace. If you do those things in this country, traditionally, you had a fair shot at being able to realize a vision of your life. That doesn't mean everyone does. It's not a human universal. It's just saying because we have a free system, the hope was always that a natural aristocracy of people can earn a place to do well here, no matter where you started at. So yeah, I love the vision of that. When I say that it's not dead, and maybe that particular way of thinking of it isn't ought versus is. When I started the organization, I originally called it the Land Liberty Movement, right? Which really suits my way of looking at it, right? Um, and I didn't want to say anything about the American dream because I thought my generation would see it as cliche, as nostalgia bait, as something that looked like, oh, that was for somebody else at some other time. But I did a poll, and we oversampled millennials and Gen Z, and we said, well, how do you feel about the American dream? And it wasn't that. That was probably the most encouraging thing I ever got back in a poll. And I've done hundreds of them in my career. And it was, no, we want the American dream. We want the opportunity to do well, just like our parents did. And the idea that it's just some thing of a bygone era was not appealing to people. They were like, if not that, well, then what are we? And so that's why we named the publishing outlet Build the Dream, where I produce our content.
Very cool. Well, on that note, then, I will disclose my age. I am 37, so I am squarely in the millennial camp. And do you think that I experience on a personal level a barrier or a struggle or even a desire to experience the American dream? And
Mhm.
then as part of that, I don't want to own a home and I
Mhm.
don't want to have children.
Mhm.
Why do you think? Feel free to take the wildest, most insulting guesses ever. That is.
Well,
So give a wild guess on me here.
oh, that's a very interesting way to approach the question. So where my values are is that I wouldn't claim to know why you would, but rather that we should have systems that allow you to embody those as long as they fit within the rule of law, right? And as long as it's not harming anybody else, right? Um, so, to me, I think people choose to not buy a home for lots of reasons, right? And usually related around, I want to be mobile, or I don't know exactly what I want to do yet. And and if that job opens up in another city, I don't want to be locked into a mortgage. Um, it has a lot to do with some of it is if you just pierce the veil of what it means to own a home, right? As a homeowner, when the water heater breaks, that's on me, right? YouTube's great, but I am not a handyman, right? That's just reality. So, like different people are going to sort themselves differently according to those values. And that's what makes us America is that we're not telling you that you must. Um, so, as an individual, what I focus on is less like in the individual financial advice of why someone you have lots of credit card debt or something like that. I wouldn't know. Um, what I focus mostly on is on the big story, right? The societal level and the public policy that affects the societal level, so that we can have a free system for people to actualize their individual potential. And on children, I have to address that because I am a huge fan of kids. As a father, uh, I've often described it like this: children are a blind corner. So I've done work in security, and when you're in a security situation, the most dangerous place is a blind corner because you can't see around it, right? Specifically, going into a room with two blinds on either side, and when you're trying to make a place safe, you need to know what's going on around that corner, but you can't without exposing yourself. So it is a incredibly scary thing. And it's something in our society that often just like is lays out only as a set of downsides of how expensive children are, how difficult they are to raise, or how disappointing they can be. But it's also the most meaningful thing that's ever happened in my life. And I can't imagine life without it. So, I can only say that. And the thing about being a blind corner is I know that makes no sense to anybody else because all you see is the barriers, right? I mean, like it's hard to know that otherwise. So, yeah, some thoughts.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I so lightly on the kids front, I always assumed that I would have kids. And then there's various personal health, all kinds of different reasons that I've ultimately chosen not to. But a large portion is that I have lived doing well, not for the children's decision, but let's say for owning a home or some of those like classic elements, right? That I've sort of chosen to be more mobile and et cetera. I mean, a lot of it is influenced, and even my concept of what having children would be like is influenced by financial barriers that exist now, by the fact that I think it was that I read that each child typically costs $300,000 over the course of their 18 years of raising them. I don't know, but that
That
again,
must be a New York figure. That
yeah.
must be a New York figure going to private
um,
school or something.
yeah. But there's all these scary things out there. I think people are starting to get more honest in my age group, at least, about how challenging it is as parents. I hear sort of two views. I hear yours, where that there were the person obviously had a lot of opportunities and choices as to have kids, decided to, was maybe, I would imagine, you're very successful, were very focused on work and things like that before, and then it's been this life-changing baptism, if you will, that has added so much meaning, and it's just so nice to hear you talk about it. And I'm glad the world has great dads like yourself. But
Can I
and
stop you
then
there real quick? Can I stop
yeah.
you there real quick? I wasn't successful. I'm s- I don't know what success means, but I'm not successful. Like I know people, I grew up in a, relatively low income place in a very rural place. I know people who live on very small amounts of money in a trailer park who have 6 kids, and they're the happiest people you've ever met. Right? Like
Mm,
your
that's a good,
relationship
yeah, I'm
to
glad you addressed that.
meaning is not just material. It's about realizing the things in life that give you purpose.
So I appreciate you pointing that out because I think, it's easy if you're just reading about stuff or it's on social media or you're in the Reddit groups of people that regret life decisions or you're among a certain group of people. Like we often stick within our little realm. So I have artist friends and very metropolitan kind of people in my life, and very like when they're having kids at 40, they're a very specific world that I'm exposed to and people that I'm close with and media that I read. And so those messages tend to reinforce that, well, you can't really do it unless you have a certain amount of money. Or like I have some friends in LA. I was just talking to him, and he does very well for himself as a contractor, as an engineer, I think now. Was doing something in the visual arts before that. is married, but they're kind of like, "Oh, can we really do it?" And they probably are doing just fine, well enough to do it. And we actually talked about that too. Like on some level, there's all these people that are making it work. So the idea that, oh, you just don't have enough money for kids. I mean, it's got to be a bit of a critical mass, right? Though, like, let's talk honestly about this for a second. You've got to hit a certain price point to not
Sure.
be making life really, really hard for your family,
Right.
right? Like, if
Right.
if I'm making just a single income and I wanted to have a kid by myself, and I'm kind of just making ends meet, let's say on my own. I mean, adding a child into that, it's probably not a wise decision.
Sure. Sure.
um
I think the value
where's the number?
matrix, yeah, I think the value matrix you're pointing to is it makes sense, right? I mean, you have to be with the right person. You have to be in the right, like a set of conditions. There's a minimum there. I'm just only saying that it's never going to feel like the right time, right? Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like you're always going to have that like that hesitation because it's scary and it's a blind corner. Now, that's actually a thing I've often talked about. Actually, is that because we've made rent so expensive, it's very difficult for people to gain the assets, to gain the opportunity to build the wealth and pursue the life they want, including having children. We have a tremendous problem in this country demographically with the collapse of the birth rate, specifically after the 2008 financial crisis, because millennials and Gen Zs, most of us never really recovered. Right. I'm 41, so just a little bit older than you. And, in the time frame of my life, what I've seen is I have a normally a large amount of kids, but most people just don't. Even in more rural places where that's much more the typical scenario that I grew up around, family size have shrunk. In part, I think, because we have credible price inflation, especially in housing. Catch this. All right. So in the 1960s, about 20% of the American public are what we call rent burdened, meaning they spend about 40% of their income on rent each month. So they take in a certain amount and 40% goes to rent. Today, that's nearly doubled to 40%. Specifically for millennials, we've averaged in our time as since we became adults, 50% rent for most people, half their money every month going to rent. That's an average. So that means a lot of people are to the right side of that, right? Now, that condition isn't a condition that just happened on its own like nature. It happens for specific reasons that are identifiable that would had not have happened had we made different choices with public policy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also making me think of you with those hangups, with the housing hangup. It's kind of a bottleneck because when people think about life planning, because we were raised to be like, okay, you go to college, you get a spouse, you get your first home, then you have the kids, right? Like there's an order of operations. And if you get to the we're married, we're gonna maybe start a family, but you can't even get the house part, people probably throw their hands up and are like, what are we gonna, we're not even in a position to be able to own a home. How can we raise a child? Blah, blah, blah. So that, I mean, it is and also just even on an unconscious psychological level with Maslow's hierarchy, right? You're kind of like, do I want to have a kid if I don't even own something for them to live in? So yeah, I can see that that would have a direct or heavily indirect relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this vision of the American life, right? That arc that you just painted actually wasn't typical until the 1940s when we had this explosion of prosperity and opportunity to build. And that's what we saw happen. But, it was from that time period of the 1930s to the 1960s where we saw this explosion in government's management of land. So that by the time LBJ is passing the Great Society, we now have almost universal zoning across everywhere. At the very beginning, it had relatively little effect, right? Because it was already mostly in line and relatively small amounts of code. A 5-year plan, will look one way to a certain set of incentives according to the planners that are making the plan. But that next 5-year plan is going to look a little different. And then you compound that so that by 1991, George H.W. Bush is putting out his very first report that says our cities are a disaster case of exploding rent and housing prices. How do we fix it? And one of the things they said was, well, zoning and building code's a major problem. We looked at that and said, that's interesting, but none of the incentives were in place to actually do anything about it, right? Because the people who are the major voting bloc at the time, the silent generation of boomers, were the people who were mostly benefiting from this legacy. They had gotten their assets in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So that by the time we got to 2008, all of a sudden we're in a completely different scenario from 2008 till today, uh, where we actually have the political opportunity now because of folks our age are looking at this and saying this is ridiculous. I'm open to any solution, including rent control on down the line to loosening up these building codes and something more similar to my vision. So I think the political opportunity changes there now, specifically because that wave is cresting and ending. Um, and we're going to look at a worsening situation the longer this goes on due to all of the incentive structures that create the price. Um, so unless we disrupt that, it's only going to get worse. And we're becoming the political majority now as boomers die off, Gen X, millennials. So
When you started, your work in this, did you have trouble? Like what was kind of the pushback that you got? What were some things that people like their automatic knee-jerk reactions? Like where were your biggest trouble spots?
yeah, yeah. I was just at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas where I got to do my very first national speech, right, in front of a crowd with Build the Dream. And I got heckled by an old lady in the crowd. And what she told me, and this was typical too of when we passed it in Montana, was that, well, I bought a deed to a home that was single family in a single family neighborhood, and you're coming along and you're changing that. You're changing the deal on me. And my response to that is that you bought a deed to your land. The Western concept for more than 1,000 years is that a deed means you own your land, and my deed means I owned my land, and your deed can't govern what my land does. This is a new concept introduced from very specific European ideas around scientific progressivism, which basically said if we wanted to improve society, what we would do is we'd take experts, we'd give them degrees, very fancy experts, we'd pay them a lot of money, and we'd put them in charge of institutions, and we'd say, here's an institution, go make it better. Well, it turns out that that's actually not a very good way to organize society, as demonstrated by building most quintessentially. There, it is the one area they've won most systemically across the country, and that's in part because they have 1,000 of them. Now, it's better than having one zoning board for the whole country. Don't get me wrong; like it could be worse. We could have the equivalent of the FDA for housing, but the but it's still impossible to centrally plan even the size we're talking about. For example, my home city, we have like 120,000 people. How does 3 people plan the lives of 120,000? No one's that smart. It's not possible to know I don't know your values,
Yeah.
Rebecca. How do I know what you need? Right? But your consuming behavior, your consumption behavior, you know those, right? So if we give you the conditions and we give builders the conditions to need to want to know and personally benefit from satisfying your values, then we create a situation in which people are more likely to be able to guess that and be able to reach there and for you to be able to build the life that you want. That's the core argument that I've been making. When I talk to young people about it, they get it. A little bit older people, if they're ideologically aligned enough, they get it. But what I mostly see is that, or this, I'm taking power away from the local government, right? Because that's mostly what the laws that I've passed and I'm advocating for do, is they say the locality can no longer establish a minimum lot size or a single family exclusive in neighborhood or have to allow ADUs, and they object that on philosophical grounds that that's the right role for government at that level. My objection to that is that, well, the problem with that is the actual right role for government and the smallest level of government to make those decisions, to have those decision rights, is the individual and the family, right? If you own a plot of land, that is yours. Now, if you do something with your land that impacts your neighbors, that's a different issue. That's for common law and ordinances and stuff like that. But if you want to put on that ADU unit so that your grandparents your parents can live close to you and help you raise your kids, and maybe that's the life scenario that would actually work for you. Well, maybe that's why we're not having as many kids, right? Because there's a lot of people whose lives would be actualized by that, but they never can get there, right? Because we've systematically said, nope, you can't build ADUs in most single family zoning in the United States. In my state, you could build it anywhere. city, county, near transit, away from transit, anywhere. And my state is still here. We haven't blown up yet. But the boomers told me it would. Everything was going to go to hell in the handbasket the minute it was. And that's not true. Because reality is this is the American system. That's how we built our cities in the first place. From New York City to Chicago to LA, these places were built before zoning for the most part.
What has been, I mean, what was the purpose of zoning other than like the government's sort of just organization and ability to manage? Was there any semi like quasi individual sort of benefit or some kind of social benefit that was supposed to be there?
100%. I mean, what was also very fashionable at the same time of scientific progressivism and how we're going to plan things in the economy in order to make the economy better for, especially always for the right people, whoever your people were, right? So, we're talking about here is the 1890s to the 1930s. So, scientific racism was a big part of that. We were going to objectively plan society to make sure our gene stock was good. That was popular in the United States. We we did terrible things to hundreds of thousands of people in this country under the name of how smart we could be because science had come to a conclusion about what the right thing to do was with population. Another one, it was a big fear of overpopulation. Paul Ehrlich write this book in the 1960s called The Population Bomb, basically predicting that we were going to have riots in the street because we'd run out of food, we'd run out of oil, all these things we'd run out of. Well, he was many things, but he was not an economist. He didn't know anything about how the economy worked. So what we did when we started running out of food is we invented ways to make more food. And then we now have an over food production problem as much as anything else. Too many calories being eaten by people that it is not enough, right? So all of his predictions were false. We still operate on the assumption that there's some kind of overpopulation problem. So in order to solve these problems of either inequality or racial issues, genetic gene stock, all that BSery, or overpopulation, that was the core motive. And then last, and like you, I think you're touching on it some important too. It turns in economics is this concept. It's called the bootlegger and Baptist problem. Are you familiar with it? Okay, so in prohibition, you have two sides of it. You have the moralist, right? The Baptists who say alcohol is bad for you. It's terrible for society. We should ban it. And you have their key supporters, the bootlegger who personally benefits, right? So the patina is always the moral argument, the thing that sits over it that says we're going to solve social problems. That's the Baptist. But the bootlegger, in this case, became the incumbent property owners, right? So the one person who benefits most from rent control, for example, is a slumlord. The one person who benefits most from not building more apartments are people who own apartments now because it reduces supply so they can charge more. You know, across each of these, if you give them a government sponsored subsidy in terms of government insurance programs, specifically because you've rent controlled in the first place, then they have every incentive to do everything bad and say, well, the government won't let me charge enough money, right? So they play both sides of that subsidy and then abuse game. So there's a lot of corruption in that system as well, and we've seen that what we call, you know, what's called in free speech law the heckler's veto, but in zoning it's called, you know, showing up to the planning commission saying, well, I don't want the wrong people moving into my neighborhood, right? And so, I mean, if you ask, you know, zoning commissions now, they're not motivated by scientific racism, right? They're motivated by the just the momentum of history and who shows up at the community meetings. And it's not going to be some person who's out busy working all day. It's going to be the retiree who owns 3 or 4 lots in the neighborhood and wants to keep their values up. So they don't want that ADU being built or that duplex.
You know, it's interesting because like you're sort of making an argument, not purposefully, but secondhand for libertarianism itself, and it's a good one. But then my question would be, so obviously the flaw here is that the plans were made for things that problems that didn't even materialize, and problems that came along overran the plans. But does having no plan, not that that's what you are proposing on a complex level, but does the lack of regulation also create a big problem? I mean, is there something there? What do you personally think zoning or the government, local government should do in terms of any oversight over housing?
So it's important to distinguish between zoning and ordinances.
Mm,
Ordinances are something that's neutral, that says, I'm not planning what you can do with the property. I just, you can't do this thing, right? So a good ordinance, said the heckler, we're going to have strip clubs next to schools, you know? And I said, that's very easily solved by an ordinance saying you can't have a strip club this close to a school. Or even better than strip club would be like an adult entertainment facility, whether that be like a video thing or like a strip club. And that's an ancient custom, actually. So a great example, I tell it all the time. I was doing a video about mixed use, right? Mixed use is how most cities were built. You build a shop on the bottom and apartments on top. It's a very
right. Yeah.
efficient way to store, to house people, to shelter people, and to have commerce. That's what makes walkable cities. Now, I'm not a planner. I'm not the guy who's going to say we need all of our cities to be walkable or something like that. But it is the system that does that, and it does that for the most natural reasons, which is everybody wants to make a profit. Everyone wants to live affordably. And it's nice to be able to walk someplace if you're in the mood to walk, right? If you want to. So, and before cars, that's, very much a thing. So, I was, this planning regime has separated all those things out. So we're going to have commercial districts over here. We're going to have housing over here and incentivize these very much spread out things so people live a long way from their homes. You don't have to solve when I'm talking about this, what I get is, but David, if we allow businesses close to apartments, then we're going to have a tallow rendering plant with apartments above it, right? And you would never want that. That's going to smell bad. And my retort is, well, two things. One, you could solve that easily with an ordinance, basically saying what you do smells, it has to be this far away from residential properties. If you think, but you only need to pass that if you think that builders are complete idiots, and they're not. Imagine this. If you're building a building and you're going to say, if I don't put people in this rental unit so I can make money on it, I lose money. So why would you allow that kind of person to be able to be at the
Smelly
bottom floor,
business.
right? Because
Yeah.
no one's going to rent from them. So this is like we turn it into like a mathematical game, like as if we could foresee, like we're going to be the planners now. My whole point is you can't plan this very well. That's why neutral, humble ordinances. What I mean by humble is, like don't do. We don't want. I'll say something controversial for the clicks. Don't do data centers in my town. Don't do that. Say if it's going to take this much noise and impact your neighbors, you can't build that here, no matter what it is. Because what's the difference between a steel mill and a data center, right? They're both producing something. They're both producing something that someone's willing to spend enormous amounts of money on. So there has to be some subjective value there for the consumer that's buying it. So they're producing something, but they have externalities. They make maybe noise. Not all of them do, but just for argument's sake. And like if we're going to have a rule, why not make a rule that allows people to say like, well, geez, I could have the data center, and what if I did one that is powered on nuclear, doesn't make any noise, and does all these things, but it could be really close to this area to service people with low latency AI that would make things better for them. And we might not even know that that's a possibility until we just establish the rule set and make it neutral. Does that make sense? To prevent the actual harm from happening, because that's really what it's about. It should really be about preventing harm. Instead, we've made it about the ego of the smart guy with the planning degree to say like, well, this is what a city should look like. But that's not what cities are. Cities are the organic construction for meeting people's needs. There's a great book. It's by Jane Jacobs. And she observed that what makes a city is its multiplicity of people solving each other's problems. Isn't that beautiful? Right? Isn't that what makes a community what it is? I mean, it's more than just the economics. It's also the problem of like having someone to go get drinks with, or to go to the dog park with, or do whatever that suits your values. So like if we get too caught up in the need to know what's going to happen, we'll never discover what's possible. So wise lawmaking means we're going to allow for the maximum amount of freedom, and then we're going to define where the harm's at and try to curb those away. And then if we can't curb those away, there's some circumstance which that's true. Say, for example, there's a legacy area that established that's already has some amount of unresolved externalities, right? So your place is already next to the railroad, right? Well, the worst thing about the progressives is they were so obsessed with industrialization. They said, too bad. You're just going to live in a loud place now. The railroad owns you nothing, even though it wakes you up in the morning every day. That wouldn't have been the common law solution to that problem. The common law solution would be like, well, you get a little bit of money from the railroad every day because we built a railroad next to your apartment building, right? And it compensates you for it because you got harmed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it
Yeah.
does. It does. Wow. Uh, I'm trying to. You've blown me away. I'm drawing a blank.
So I get very
Well,
passionate about this topic.
no, I love it. I'm learning a lot. So what do you think then? Let's you pull this back to the larger question of people being able to build out that quote unquote American dream, or the getting the owning a home, building a life for themselves, having their own setup and their own. What do you think like needs to change? Do you think we can get back to the the heart of it, and or do you think there's something new around the corner that people just kind of have to be like, okay, let's create a new version of a dream that's actually workable? That, I mean, is it a question of totally different on the housing thing, housing structures that are just very affordable, or communal living for younger people that's more formalized? Or, I mean, what do you think are some solutions? And do you think that we need a new version of the dream, of the idea?
Yes, that's a great question. So I'll start with the solutions, and if I don't get to the new vision of the dream, get back to
I'll
me,
bring
okay?
you back.
I'll take too long on solutions. There's so many. So the best place to start is with a very simple statistic. In the 1960s, about 40% of all new home construction, and when I mean home construction, what I mean is apartments and build and single family undetached, suburbia. 40% was targeted towards those kinds of demographics of the purchasing market, right? So we're talking under 1,500 square feet. Today, that's 7%. At the same time, families have halved in size, but our houses have gotten much bigger and more expensive because they're bigger, because we put them on bigger lots. Now, here's the story. In the 1960s and 70s, they said, well, single family zoning, it is what it is, but people are still building these tiny little affordable places. And sometimes the wrong people are moving in because they're affordable for those people. So how do we make it single family undetached, but unaffordable for the wrong kind of people? And so what they said, basically, I mean, and this goes many different ways, cuts a lot of different grain. It's just poor white people, poor black, it's just the wrong kinds of values for the people who are making the decisions. Um, and what they implemented was called minimum lot size. And so what that does is it sets a floor. And when you're, as a developer, plotting out your land units, right? So you buy like a big chunk of land, right? And I'm going to create a community here. And I'm going to have shops here, and I'm going to do all these things. And it says you can't build it smaller, a lot size smaller than this. And these lot size go up, and the size of houses go up, and then the family size goes down over that period of time, making less people able to afford a home. That's why today the median start for a home buyer in this country is 40. In the 1980s, it was 29. Right? That just means lots of people decide to buy a home. But what it shows is like, I don't think people's values change that much. I think a lot of people still like to buy a home, but we've functionally banned the starter home. We functionally banned the low income apartment building the same way. Through minimum lot sizes, because if you make an apartment you could make apartment buildings smaller and more affordable, but still have multiple units in them, right? And that could look like communal living situations. That's something for entrepreneurs to figure out. I wouldn't know what the right solution is. My solution is always to establish the conditions in which people who have to bet their own money on the future can do so, because those are the people who are most likely to be right. We want to make a million bets, not David's bet. Right. So the solution to me looks like addressing the barriers that have artificially made apartment construction, and, and I'm talking about everything from townhomes to like big apartment complexes. And additionally, there's a bunch of other building regulations that change too. Oh yeah, this is a great one because you're from New York, right? Yeah. So New York is one of the, what's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, oh man, I believe it's New Jersey. Is one of the few, there's a small community in New Jersey. It's one of the few that have courtyard construction, right? Okay, so one of the other regulations that they implemented were called setbacks. And this is where you get those like front yards, and sometimes they have a front yard that's like completely useless, right? That's like a just a little chunk of grass that's just mandated by the state that everyone hates to take care of. That traditionally was a very inefficient use of property, so people didn't do it like that. They built smaller, more narrow lots, and they moved the apartment building to the front. Well, back in the day, they looked at it like, how do we build? We want to take some more lessons of how to build our community in this community in New Jersey. And they went to Europe and they looked around. They said, we really like this shape of house. And then what it is it moves that front of the building up close to the property line. And then it builds into a square, a hollow square with a little hole in the middle. So you've seen these all over Europe. And they're like one of the most popular ways to house people, specifically in like apartment things. And there's a great Substack you should check out. It's called The Courtyard Urbanist. I interviewed her recently. She does an amazing work here. We disagree on some things, but I think her point that when it comes to that place where you're like in the American mind, like I have to buy a single family undetached before I can have children. It's like that's silly. That's not how it actually works. You could buy that townhome, or you could buy a condo or whatever. But man, a courtyard in so many places would be better for a family, right? Because you have a protected interior lot, especially in an urban environment, that you might like better than having a front yard or having a backyard, right? Build around the outside and then fill in the inside. Lots of ways to solve that problem, but we can't solve that as long as we have setback requirements the way they are that are uniform. It prevents the innovation from happening in the marketplace where someone could say, I've been to Europe and I really like courtyards, so I want to build this here, right? So there's a tremendous amount of lost potential that's just never discovered that could have been discovered if we just had the freedom to build. Lastly, that what I can say about what will happen in the future is I don't believe anything happens without a change of values, right? A fundamental value that believes in people, that doesn't look at somebody as like, well, he made money, so he must be a bad guy, right? Because the developer here is not your enemy. The developer here is just doing his job, you know. Now sometimes they could be greedy, they could be demonstrating vice in some way, in some particular way. I'm not defending all individuals who happen to be developers. What I'm saying is, as an institution of, do you believe that if we just gave people the right to make bets, that we get on average better decisions than if we gave an elite group of people all the power to decide everything? To me, I would much rather take the make bets, because then you could get the more moral developer versus the more greedy developer. You could have all the different kinds of people in there fighting it out for what solves your needs the most. Because at the end of the day, in free systems, your consuming ability gives you power. But as long as it's managed by a bureaucrat, your consuming ability means nothing unless you're wealthy. Right? That's the beauty of the market systems. Well, honestly, not the market systems. That takes it away. The birthright of Americans that we had, and then we gave it up for a novel new idea that was completely un-American.
What would you the novel new idea being the way that they managed housing and zoning and all of that?
Well, yeah, I would say that, and and I don't know you or your audience. I don't know your politics. I don't know anything like that. But I'd say that. But I'd say that about much larger issues as well, right? That ultimately, these systems will be better solved in many other dimensions through more neutral, more bottom up, more entrepreneurial trust in each other as Americans. Like, no wonder we don't have any, social trust anymore. All our institutions are dying because they're based upon a presumption that was false, that you could put people in charge and they could plan everything. So it's really what I identify, and it's a crude term. It's not exactly captures every dimension of it, but I try to summarize it as fairly and as steel mannered as possible, which is scientific progressivism. Doesn't mean all progressives believe this. In fact, a lot of progressives like Ezra Klein and others are coming our way when it comes to these issues, when it comes to thinking about how markets can better serve the lowest income folks. And I love the spirit of like, I really care about how poor people are doing. As someone who grew up in that place, I very much appreciate it. The question is does it actually achieve it? Does it actually achieve that vision? Or is it just the good feels of saying we did something with government, so therefore it must have been the right thing, right? And when you look at the data, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's really what's happened. I think it's actually gotten much harder for poor people uh, in some developments, specifically where the bureaucrats have had the most amount of power, like housing.
It's so interesting because I'll tell you, I'm liberal, and my thought whenever the sort of general concept of, well, a lot of the things that we try to do to solve the problem make it worse. I think the fear is, okay, so if we throw all the things out with the solution, you're betting, not you, but the weak argument is betting on the idea that there will be enough good people who will happen to come through, and they'll come up with a better solution than the government ever could. But I don't believe in the altruism of people enough, or and then it gets into the whole question of, do we believe that capitalism works well and all of that? But
But
I
wait,
think
wait.
that
Can I jump in
go
there?
ahead.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
my argument isn't that people will be altruistic and good and that will create good outcomes. It's that you know better for your life what will realize its best outcome than anyone else does. That's the only thing I'm arguing, because your
yeah, yeah. That's
consumer
fair.
power is more powerful than you realize.
Yeah, okay,
Does that make sense?
that's totally fair. I think the more of the question is, the people who are already doing well are the ones that are going to be able to come up with, typically, right? They're going to have more opportunity to be the moving the needle, right? To have influence, to have the business, right? So there is a group of people, and you could say, like, yeah, hardship makes us more creative. Actually, they will come to the top. But there's groups of people who are, um, for whatever reason, do not have the resources to become decision makers. And so if we don't have anything coming in to protect, or to try to at least say that it stands for, the people who are lower in the sphere of things, in opportunities and all of that, it is anyone really going to help them, or is it only going to be if it works for them? Does that make
Yeah.
sense? I feel like I'm
But yes,
wow.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, like, there's no doubt, it's called the Matthew principle, right? To he who is given, much is required, and much more will be given, right? That if you have access to resources, you're more likely to get access to that next batch of resources. You have a great network, that next business deal is just around the corner. But when you're just getting started, you're just looking for that one person to believe in you, man. And if you could just get that one, then maybe everything else can open that door. That's the life. That's life, right? There's no government policy that can change that. Now the question is what do we do? What do we make sure? How do we make sure that? I think especially when you look to folks that can't take care of themselves, or have social needs that where they can't do those sorts of things. Well, I'm not convinced personally that we've been able to really solve that problem with our current set of solutions. And I'm
Absolutely
not
not.
sure
Yeah, I agree
the
with
the
you.
same
Yeah.
approach is going to continue to do that. But I can tell you that a city in Northern Virginia spent 7 years, no, sorry, 15 years and $7 million trying to build housing for homeless people. And the local county said no the whole time. They didn't win until they passed a law called Yes in God's Backyard. Then they won. The state legislature and governor acted before that local area. Okay, so most churches are actually built in residential areas, right? So in order to build some little bit of housing, because you got members in your congregation that are sleeping in their car, you got to ask for what's called to change your zoning designation, right? So you say, well, we don't want to be single family, we want to be something else, right? That it's called the variance. That variance requires the approval of just some random bureaucrats. And who do they pick up? Who picks up the phone first? The relatively small, a couple hundred member delegation from their church congregation, or the millions of people that they manage in Northern Virginia, whose properties, they are looking at? Well, it's going to be the wealthiest people, right? If it's in a wealthy neighborhood, they're going to swing a lot more clout. But if you have a property rate system, that church can do what it wants to serve its community, right? And that's that system of proximal service, like service that's close to each other, right? So in going all the way back to medieval Europe, there was this concept called subsidization, where we as friends solve each other's problems. A family solves each other's problems better than, than most problems should be solved there. We as friends solve problems. We as a, block can solve problems. We as, free acting individuals as an entrepreneur solve problems. And then the church solves other social problems. And we escalate this ladder up till eventually get to the place where, well, maybe we have to use force to solve this problem. We can't persuade people. There's just not enough. We got to solve. So we try to solve it that way. And we do it on a local level. And then maybe we go to the state, and maybe we go to the federal level. That idea of an escalating ladder was a core idea that created the conditions in which we passed the Bill of Rights and created all the systems in of our society that inform our baseline of what it means to be an American. And then we just threw it all away. And we said, we're going to skip local friendship, family, the block, the neighborhood, the church, and we're going to go straight to the local government, the state, for almost all problems, if not the federal government. And what has been the consequence of that, right? Like, what has really been the consequence? Well, it means that church can't house people. We got homeless people sleeping in the streets everywhere. We got a place where, and in the video, the same content release where I talk about that Virginia church, I talk about churches in California who got the variance. Very luckily, they just happened to have the right board. And they built housing. It was $58,000 per unit to build housing for homeless people. The state government spent $700,000 to build it per unit, which serves the homeless better. Right. So, and that's not that's not me saying like churches are better than government. What I'm saying is that you're solving proximal problems that are closely, so that I can actually understand the issue. If you give it to some distant bureaucrat, how are they going to understand the issue? They don't know. Right. So it's better to have businesses and relationships and people who actually like know the person they're trying to solve the issue for, to try to solve those issues. And we can't do that in a state of management by a bureaucrat or by a committee.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. What would you say is the biggest misnomer people have about housing, owning a home, and any of this that you would like to correct?
Geez. So I always want to say this because it's some personal advice, and I actually got it from John A. Allison. He was the president of BB&T, which is you probably know what that is. It's a big bank on the East Coast.
I actually don't. Oh
Oh,
yeah,
really?
okay. Oh, bank.
It's
Okay.
all
Yeah.
over the East Coast. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're not out where I'm at, and they're not really on the West, or there are some on the West Coast, but the interior of the country, this largely doesn't have. And what he wrote in his book, The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure, it's all about the 2008 financial crisis. It's a really great book about that. But one of the things he said is like, it's important for people to understand, and he's given out like millions of home loans, right, through his work, is that a home, if you're buying one, it's a consumption product, right? At the end of the day, like we treat it like an asset, and it is an asset because, there's limited land, and they're hard, they're not easy to build, and they take resources, and, and then we constrain it even more with government that really inflate the prices to make it look like the same kind of asset that buying gold is, but it isn't, because when gold doesn't break and now you can't use your toilet, and people tend to underestimate that. They tend not to really see that. So when they're doing their budget and they're really thinking about buying their first home, they don't really budget enough, in my experience, like that maintenance cost, much less time cost. You got a yard, you got to mow it. That's the reality. And if you don't mow it, you're going to pay a cost, and it sucks. So don't do that. Like it's stuff like that. And as far as the other part of it, I think most people feel powerless. They feel demotivated. They feel like there's no solution to these problems. Like the housing crisis just dropped on our heads, and it's just what it means to be a millennial or to be a Zoomer, right? But it's not. None of it's inevitable. It isn't. It's all a matter of whether or not we want to face it or not. There are generations of Americans who completely transformed this country in less than a decade, only by deciding to act together, only by deciding, oh man, David's not just like me. He's some hick from Montana. I can't trust that kind of guy, right? Looking beyond that and looking to the ideas and our commonalities and the things that bring us together as Americans, we were able to completely transform this country multiple times to solve social needs. I'm thinking about civil rights. I think about every major problem we've had as a country. We can do this in housing. Why not? But first, we have to grapple with, what is the problem? Where does it come from? My case is that it's government. Ezra Klein, a progressive liberal Democrat, thinks it's the government too. he's saying, guys, this is a crazy moment for me as a very rural person. Guys, the EPA is not a sacred institution. It either serves us or it doesn't, right? When the EPA is shutting down solar farms and wind farms, that's not fitting the solar vision. Now, I don't know about solar farms and wind farms on a generational scale. We can have the policy debate, but geez, I agree. It isn't serving our needs, right? So what are we going to do about it? Well, in housing, there's this awesome triangulation right now where all we need to do is pull together enough of the right, which is really my job. My job is to do that, and then pull the rest enough of the left together to say, hey, look, we're going to tolerate some more folks on that make money doing this, making money. That's that my appeal to the left. And my appeal to the right is we're going to open up the reality that who we are as Americans is not the busybody. We had mind your own business on our money because that's who we were. And we can be that again. And in fact, when we lean into the scientific progressivism thing, we're not really being conservatives. We're not really being who we're supposed to be. And if we trust that our founders were wise, that our heritage and our birthrights were wise to begin with, we have an opportunity to transform things and guarantee the future of our country. Not to mention the other collateral benefits of this, such as children growing up close to their grandchildren or grandparents, and people not being forced out of their homes or forced out of their communities. Those sorts of things are the things that destroy that communitarian vision that conservatives are trying to hold on to. Triangulating between those two are the only way I was ever able to pass legislation. But right now, where we're at is we have a left wing that's coming our way and a conservative right that isn't sure what to do with this issue, does not know how to solve this problem yet. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is trying to bring the right into a full understanding of our context of who we are, where we're at, so that we can actually guarantee a future where people can prosper.
Well, this has been very informative for me, and I look forward to following up with some resources for my own education. I know where to find you, but why don't you tell everyone else where they can find out more?
Yeah, go to buildtheamericandream.org. Just go there. It goes directly to my Substack. All my stuff comes out on Substack. You can punch your email in there, go right into your inbox. And if you're a Substack user, please, please, please just restack it, growing steadily, but I really need more amplification. I need the voices of regular people because, I'm not like some wealthy celebrity who started a podcast. I'm a regular dude from out in the middle of nowhere trying to bring a lot of things I've been able to learn to the public so that we can pass this in the other 49 states.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.